Imagine, if you will, that you are sitting in a courtroom.
Okay, I am picturing it.
It is dead silent in there. Like the air is just thick with anticipation.
Right, highly tense.
Exactly. And standing right in the center of the room is this brilliant, incredibly articulate atheist prosecutor.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. He points a finger directly at the doc and he just launches into his opening statement.
Setting the stage.
Right. And he accuses the God of the Bible of being fundamentally two entirely different entities.
Yeah, I know this argument.
You've heard this, right?
Right.
He tells the jury, I mean, you, the listener, to look at the evidence. He says, in the Old Testament, you have this God of violence.
A God of wrath.
Yes, wrath, judgment, a God who is out there commanding wars and banishment.
Right, the classic angry deity trope.
Exactly. And the prosecutor argues that if that behavior is supposed to be quote unquote good, well, then the word good has completely lost its meaning.
It's a really strong emotional appeal.
It is. But then he says you turn the page to the New Testament and suddenly, you have Jesus. A total shift.
Right. You have commands to love your enemies, to forgive people, to just show this endless mercy.
Yeah.
So the prosecutor looks at the jury and just says, honestly, that cannot be the same God.
It just doesn't compute for him.
Exactly. He says it cannot be the same morality.
Yeah.
He claims you are looking at an evil God in the Old Testament and a good God in the New Testament.
It is an incredibly powerful accusation, honestly.
It really is.
And, it is a scene that just perfectly captures the underlying tension of the material we are examining today.
Yes. Welcome to the deep dive.
Today, we are looking at a really highly detailed academic lecture. It's titled Evil and God in the Old and New Testament by Matthias Florek.
Right. And just so you, the listener, know exactly where we are heading today, our mission for this deep dive is not to just wave away that prosecutor's charge.
No, not at all.
We are definitely not going to dismiss it with some cheap religious comfort.
Or just tell you to, have faith.
Exactly. That is a cop-out. We are putting this entire theological framework on trial today. We really are.
We are going to carefully test how this source material argues against this two gods caricature.
And we're going to do that using a very structured 5-part academic analysis from the lecture.
But to do that fairly, I think we actually have to step back, before the trial even begins.
Right. We have to address a foundational premise first.
Yes, let's unpack this.
So, the lecture borrows this concept from theologian Christopher Wright, and it just completely reorients how we look at suffering.
Okay, what is the premise?
The premise is simply this: evil makes no sense.
Okay, wait.
Yeah.
Evil makes no sense. I mean, if I am sitting in the gallery of that courtroom and my life has been, touched by a real tragedy,
Right.
Hearing an academic say evil makes no sense almost sounds like, I don't know, it sounds like throwing our hands up.
It feels dismissive.
Yeah. It feels like a refusal to engage with literally the hardest question of human existence.
Yeah.
Why is that our starting point?
Well, it's because of what the human brain naturally tries to do with suffering.
Which is what?
When something terrible happens, our immediate desperate instinct is to search for a reason.
We want the why.
Exactly. We want to find the meaning behind the tragedy.
Yeah.
But the lecture points out a profound philosophical danger in that pursuit.
A danger in looking for meaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because meaning, by its very definition, is inherently good.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
To find the meaning of something is to discover its purpose, right?
Yeah.
Its value, its place in a positive, orderly universe.
Right, like when people say, this terrible thing happened so that this other beautiful thing could happen later.
We hear that all the time.
All the time. People mean well when they say it.
They do. But the framework here insists that evil is fundamentally a negation.
A negation.
Yes, it is parasite. It is the absence or the corruption of the good.
Wow, okay.
Therefore, trying to find an ultimate underlying logic or some, divine reason behind why a specific horrific act of evil happens, that is actually a trap.
Wait, let me make sure I'm really getting this. Are you saying that if we try to force a meaning onto a tragedy, we end up, inadvertently justifying it?
That is exactly what happens.
Because if I say, well, this awful injustice was actually necessary for God to teach humanity a lesson.
Right, then suddenly the evil wasn't really evil.
It was just a harsh tool for good.
Precisely. You have just made the evil necessary. You have given it a legitimate, sanctioned place in the universe.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
The lecture insists that we must never do that. We must not gloss over the horror of evil by just dressing it up in a neat, tidy little explanation.
So we shouldn't try to make the math work.
No. We can acknowledge the mystery of its origins, sure, but we are never called to accept it or to find a satisfying logic for it.
So what are we called to do then?
We are called to name it as an intruder, to lament it, and to actively resist it.
That completely flips the script.
It really does.
We aren't looking for a mathematical formula to explain why bad things happen. We are looking at how God responds to this senseless intruder.
Yes, the response is what matters.
So if that is our baseline, where do we start the actual analysis? How do we begin to answer that prosecutor's charge about this violently different God in the Old Testament?
We have to start by getting our definitions completely straight.
Okay.
That is the first part of the lecture's framework. It's called the categorization of evil.
The categorization of evil. Because, right now in our modern conversations, we tend to take literally every bad thing that happens.
Steal everything.
From a hurricane to a bank robbery to systemic poverty to like a genetic disease.
And we just dump it all into one giant vague bucket labeled evil.
And if the bucket is that messy, any judgment we make about God's response is going to be completely confused.
It has to be.
Like, if I am angry at God about a tsunami, that is a fundamentally different type of anger than being mad at God because a dictator is oppressing a whole country.
Exactly. So the lecture provides a very specific matrix to dissect what we are actually talking about when we say evil.
Okay, let's go through the matrix.
The first major axis we need to understand is the distinction between moral evil and natural evil.
Let's break that down for the listener. Moral evil is suffering that has a fingerprint on it, right?
Yes, a human fingerprint.
It is directly caused by humans. We are talking about abuse, murder, betrayal, fraud, war.
In these instances, there's a very clear perpetrator.
You can literally point to a person or a group of people who made a conscious decision to inflict harm on someone else.
And because there is a perpetrator, the theological question that moral evil raises is highly specific.
What is the question?
When we witness moral evil, the question we hurl at the dock is, why does God allow perpetrators to act?
Right. If God is so good, why doesn't he just step in and paralyze the hand of the murderer before the strike actually happens?
That's the core of the moral evil dilemma. But natural evil is entirely different.
Right, because natural evil is suffering where there is no human perpetrator to point at.
No one to blame directly.
We are talking about childhood leukemia, earthquakes, tsunamis, genetic disorders.
The devastation is just as profound.
It's horrific. But the origin is not a human choice.
Which means the question it raises must also be completely different.
So natural evil doesn't ask why God allows bad human choices.
No. It asks, why is the physical world inherently so fragile?
Wow. Why does the architecture of creation itself produce suffering?
Exactly. And if we confuse these two quadrants, we end up asking the wrong questions of the biblical texts entirely.
I see.
The Bible addresses both of them, of course. But it does not treat a corrupt, violent king the same way it treats a regional famine.
That makes a ton of sense. So that is the first axis, moral versus natural. What is the second part of this matrix?
The lecture introduces a second axis that forces us to look at the scale of the damage.
The scale.
Yes. We have to distinguish between individual evil and structural evil.
Okay, so individual evil is like micro level.
Right. It is one person making a choice to harm another person.
One person lying to their neighbor. Or one person stealing a car.
Exactly. But the lecture emphasizes a terrifying reality about human brokenness.
Which is?
It scales. It doesn't just remain isolated.
Oh, man.
When individual sins like greed or fear or the desire to dominate others, when those are repeated and institutionalized, they seep into our laws.
And into our cultural norms.
Yes, and into our economic systems.
Yeah.
That is structural evil.
I really want to pause on this concept for a second because the text uses a phrase that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
The sin with infrastructure phrase.
Yes. It calls structural evil sin with infrastructure.
It's so descriptive.
It is. If you are listening to this, think about it like a board game.
Okay, a board game analogy.
Individual evil is when one player decides to cheat. They just steal a $500 bill from the bank when the other players look away.
Right. An isolated rule break.
But structural evil is when the rules of the board game itself have been secretly rewritten so that one player is mathematically guaranteed to win and another player is mathematically guaranteed to go bankrupt no matter how perfectly they play.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
It's just baked into the system.
Structural evil is exactly that. It's exploitation systems, institutional corruption, discriminatory laws.
Even the disproportionate risk of famine based on engineered societal vulnerabilities.
Yes, and the reason this distinction is absolutely vital for answering our courtroom prosecutor is this.
Tell me.
When modern readers look at the violent judgments in the Old Testament, they almost always imagine God dropping a hammer on individual, isolated perpetrators.
Right. We picture God getting super mad because one guy broke a minor rule, so God just wipes out a whole town.
But the lecture points out that the biblical narrative is intensely focused on the macro level.
The structural level.
Yes, God's most severe judgments are almost entirely aimed at dismantling that rigged board game.
He targets the infrastructure.
He targets nations, empires, corrupt rulers, and these deeply entrenched dynamics of structural oppression.
We will definitely get into the specific examples of this later on.
Oh, we will. But we have to recognize up front that the Bible sees systemic injustice as a primary target for divine intervention.
Which brings us to a moment in the lecture that is, frankly, incredibly uncomfortable.
Ah, yes. The mirror moment.
The material literally calls it the mirror moment. Because up until now, as we sit in our theoretical courtroom, it has been very easy to act as the jury.
We love being the jury.
We really do. We can look out at the world, point at the individual murderers, point at the corrupt political systems, and just demand that God do something about them.
We want justice for the bad guys.
Yes, those people over there.
But the biblical text refuses to let the reader stay in that comfortable, detached spectator seat.
It doesn't let us off the hook.
Not at all. What is fascinating here is how the gospel completely undercuts human self-righteousness.
How does it do that?
It does not begin by validating our accusation that those people out there are the sole problem. Instead, the narrative holds up a mirror.
Hence the name.
Exactly. It asserts that sin is not merely a catalog of bad actions committed by other people.
It's deeper than that.
It is a fundamental power, a corruption, that has taken root in the human heart.
In literally every human heart.
Yes, universally.
Wow.
Recognizing this shared complicity fundamentally changes the nature of the courtroom trial.
Because if the prosecutor demands that a truly good God must ruthlessly and immediately eradicate all evil from the earth,
the mirror moment forces us to realize that we would be caught in that exact same sweep.
because none of us have perfectly clean hands.
Exactly.
Like if God is going to eliminate all selfishness, all greed, and the literal seeds of exploitation, I cannot confidently say I would survive that purge.
None of us could. The lecture notes that acknowledging this doesn't make the theological questions about suffering any easier to answer.
No, it actually makes it harder.
But it makes the conversation vastly more honest. We cannot talk about God judging evil without acknowledging our own participation in the very thing we are asking him to destroy.
It is a deeply humbling realization.
It shifts the focus from external judgment to internal self-reflection.
Okay, so if we now have this robust, multidimensional definition of what evil is.
Right, that it is moral, natural, structural, and deeply internal.
Exactly. How does the source material explain where this all came from?
We have to look at origins.
Right. If we are going to understand how God responds to evil across the whole Bible, we have to see how the break happened in the first place.
That leads us to the second formal category of the analysis. It's called theological continuity.
Or what the lecture calls the one God thesis.
Yes. To trace the origin of this brokenness, the lecture directs us to the book of Genesis, specifically chapter 3.
The famous Garden of Eden story.
But it is critical to state an academic parameter right up front here.
What's the parameter?
The source material explicitly notes that Genesis 3 is not meant to be read as an exhaustive cosmological blueprint.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it's not detailing exactly how the physics of evil entered a perfect universe.
So it is not a scientific textbook answering every literal why question about the origin of the universe.
No, not at all. Rather, it functions as a profound archetypal model text.
It shows us a pattern.
Exactly. It shows us the pattern of how evil operates in the human condition.
And what really stands out to me is that the pattern doesn't start with someone picking up a rock and committing murder.
No, the violence comes later.
It starts with a conversation.
A very subtle conversation.
Right. It starts with a very subtle planting of distrust. The serpent doesn't tell humanity to go be violent.
The serpent just asks a question.
Did God really say?
Yes. The underlying suggestion being whispered is, does God really mean well?
Does he actually have your best interests at heart?
That is the absolute core of the fall, according to the lecture.
That suspicion.
Yes, the genesis of evil is a deep, creeping suspicion regarding the goodness of God.
Wow.
Once humans accept the premise that God might be holding out on them.
That his character is somehow flawed.
Right. Or that his rules are meant to restrict them rather than protect them.
Then autonomy suddenly seems like a much safer path than trust.
Exactly. We decide to call the shots.
But the moment humanity seizes that autonomy, the moment we say, we will determine the standard of good and evil for ourselves,
Things fall apart.
the text shows a catastrophic fracturing of reality.
The total collapse.
The lecture breaks this down into a breakage in 4 directions.
And I think we really need to look at each one of those directions.
Yes, because it perfectly explains the matrix of evil we just talked about.
Let's walk through them. The first breakage is the relationship toward God.
What happens there?
What was designed to be absolute trust immediately devolves into fear.
Oh,
The
right.
text says humans hide themselves. The fundamental connection to the source of life is severed entirely.
Okay, so that's the first break. What's the second?
The second breakage is internal. The relationship with the self shatters.
Because for the first time, humanity experiences shame.
Exactly. They realize they are naked,
Yeah.
and their immediate instinct is self-protection.
You build walls.
They do.
Oh.
That psychological fragmentation is the birth of individual evil.
The insecurity, the ego, the desperate need to prove oneself.
It all starts right there.
Yeah.
Now, the third breakage moves outward to interpersonal relationships.
Between humans.
Yes, the immediate consequence of God confronting them is that trust between humans is replaced by competition and blame.
Right. The man immediately blames the woman.
And the woman blames the serpent.
The other is suddenly perceived as a threat.
And this is the seed that eventually grows into structural evil and massive warfare.
Which leaves the fourth breakage.
Yes, which ties directly back to our natural evil quadrant.
The relationship with creation itself.
Right. The physical world becomes a place of hardship, thorns, pain, and ultimate fragility.
Order literally dissolves into a chaotic struggle for survival.
But here's the critical pivot for our courtroom defense.
Okay, bring us back to the trial.
How does God respond to this 4-way catastrophic breakage?
Well, the atheist prosecutor implies that the Old Testament God is a reactionary tyrant.
Just waiting for an excuse to strike with violent wrath.
Exactly. But the textual evidence of Genesis 3 shows a completely different divine reflex.
It really does.
Because, if God was just pure, unadulterated wrath, chapter 3 would just be the end of the book.
God would just wipe them out and start over on another planet.
Exactly. But God's first counter movement is fundamentally redemptive.
Redemptive, yes.
The text highlights 4 specific actions God takes. First, God seeks. He walks into the garden and asks, "Where are you?"
And we really must note, an omniscient being does not ask that because he lost track of them geographically.
Right. He didn't just misplace them.
No. He is calling them out of their self-imposed hiding. He is initiating contact.
Okay, second, God speaks truth. He names the evil.
He doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, he doesn't gaslight them or say, "Oh, it's no big deal, don't worry about it." He clarifies the exact nature of what has broken.
Which is painful but necessary.
Yes. Third, he demands responsibility. He cuts through the blame shifting and forces them to own their autonomy.
No more pointing fingers.
And fourth, and the lecture anchors the entire rest of the Bible on this, God sets hope.
Hope.
Yes. Even in the very breath of pronouncing the painful consequences of their rebellion, a promise is given.
A promise about the serpent.
God declares that the serpent, the source of this deception, will ultimately be crushed.
Evil is formally put on notice.
Yes, it will not have the last word.
This active, seeking, truthful, judging, and hopeful response forms the absolute baseline for understanding literally everything that follows in the text.
God does not abandon creation to the parasite of evil.
No. He commits to confronting it head on.
Which brings us directly to the massive historical misunderstanding that our prosecutor is using as his main weapon.
The Marcion trap.
Yes, the lecture refers to this as the Marcion trap.
Let's define this for the listener because it is exactly what we're dealing with today.
Okay, so Marcion was a guy who lives in the 2nd century.
A very long time ago.
Right. And he looked at the Christian scriptures, and he felt the exact same discomfort our modern prosecutor feels when reading the Old Testament.
He didn't like the violence.
Not at all. So he decided to solve the problem with a pair of scissors.
Literal scissors, basically.
He essentially said, these have to be 2 different deities. He argued that the Old Testament God was a demiurge.
And a demiurge, in that ancient philosophical context, was a lesser, flawed, sometimes ignorant or even petty creator deity.
Right, a secondary god.
Marcion believed this demiurge was completely separate from the supreme, loving Father God that Jesus revealed in the New Testament.
So Marcion just wanted to throw out the Old Testament entirely.
He tried to.
And the early church universally condemned this as a massive heresy.
They absolutely rejected it.
They insisted from the very beginning that there is only one God and the story is continuous.
But if we are going to avoid the Marcion trap,
If we are going to insist to the jury that the nature of God does not change,
we have to answer the obvious question.
how do we explain the radically different feel of the text?
Exactly.
Like, how do you reconcile a God who floods the earth with a Jesus who says, turn the other cheek?
The lecture provides a highly structured, two-level solution to this apparent contradiction.
Okay, what is level one?
Level 1 requires a major paradigm shift in how we understand God's character. The lecture uses a specific term,
Which is
holy love.
holy love.
Yes, often in our modern framing, we treat holiness and love, or justice and mercy, as if they are opposing forces.
Sitting on opposite ends of a seesaw within God's mind. Like they're constantly competing for dominance.
Like God wakes up on Monday feeling incredibly just and wrathful,
And he wants to strike people with lightning.
but then by Thursday he's feeling merciful and forgiving, so he holds back.
That seesaw idea is so common.
It is. But the source material argues that this seesaw view is a fundamentally flawed understanding of the divine nature.
So what is the alternative?
In God, justice and mercy are not divided factions. They are a completely integrated singular nature.
Integrated.
Yes. If God is perfectly good, then his love cannot simply ignore evil.
Right.
His justice is actually an expression of his love for the victims of evil.
Oh, I see.
And his mercy is an expression of his desire to redeem the perpetrators of it.
It is entirely holy love all the time.
Exactly. The character is constant.
Okay, I am tracking with level one. The internal character of God never fluctuates,
Never.
but that still doesn't explain why his external actions look so different across the pages of the Bible.
That is where level 2 comes in.
Okay, level two.
Salvation history is unfolding.
Unfolding history.
We have to realize that the Bible isn't a static dictionary listing God's attributes in alphabetical order.
Right, it's not an encyclopedia.
It is a narrative timeline. It is a progressive story.
How does the timeline progress?
You move from the universal creation to the highly specific covenant with the nation of Israel,
Then what?
through the era of the prophets, to the incarnation of Christ, the establishment of the worldwide church, and finally to the consummation, which is the end of the age.
So you are saying the actions of God look different, not because his mood changed, but because the stage of the rescue mission has changed.
Exactly. The context in which God is operating is literally moving forward on a historical timeline.
Can you give an example of how the stage changes?
Think about the Old Testament. The focus is intensely concentrated on a specific people group.
Israel.
Yes. Living in a specific geographic land, serving as the sole bearer of the covenant promise.
And they are living in a brutal, ancient, and highly volatile world.
Exactly. So the actions required to protect that fragile line of promise in that specific historical era
Are going to look vastly different than the actions taken during the era of the universal worldwide church after the resurrection.
Yes, the reality on the ground demands a different tactical approach.
Let me see if I can put an analogy to this because it helps me ground it.
Go for it.
Think about a good parent.
Okay.
The exact same parent has a constant, deeply integrated character of love for their child.
Right. The parent's nature doesn't change.
Exactly. But how that love actually manifests in action depends entirely on the reality of the situation the child is in.
Okay, what do you mean?
If a child trips on the sidewalk and scrapes their knee, that parent's love manifests as incredible gentleness.
Cleaning the wound, applying a bandage, speaking softly.
Right. That is mercy. But if a violent intruder kicks down the front door and threatens the life of that exact same child,
Oh, wow.
that exact same parent's love will instantly manifest as ferocious, aggressive, uncompromising defense.
As justice and judgment.
Yes. The character of the parent didn't suddenly fracture into two different personalities.
No, not at all.
The parent's nature remained entirely constant. The historical application of that love simply responded to the reality of the threat.
That is a brilliant illustration of the lecture's point.
Thanks.
And honestly, that parent analogy transitions us perfectly into the third formal category of the analysis.
Which
It
is
tackles what is undoubtedly the most controversial and difficult concept in the entire Old Testament.
the divine warrior motif.
Yes. Or, as the material profoundly relabels it, defensive love.
Defensive love. Now, I really have to push back here. Hard.
Let's hear it.
Because even saying the words divine warrior out loud, it sounds incredibly aggressive.
It does sound violent.
If I'm the prosecutor and you just admitted that your God acts like a ferocious defender or a warrior, I'm going to slam my hands on the table and say, I rest my case.
You admitted it.
Right. You just admitted your God is a warlord who uses violence. How does this not play right into my accusation of divine sadism?
It's a totally valid and necessary pushback.
How do you justify the collateral damage?
The lecture addresses it by dismantling a very silent modern assumption that we bring to the text.
What assumption?
We have been culturally conditioned, often by very sanitized versions of spirituality, to believe that a truly good God must always be entirely gentle.
Passive and non-confrontational.
Yes, we want a therapist God.
We really do.
But the core thesis of this section of the lecture is a stark, jarring challenge to that assumption.
Let's hear the thesis.
Love that stands by and watches is not love.
Wow. Love that stands by and watches is not love. That carries a massive amount of weight.
Build about the matrix of evil we established earlier.
The structural and individual evil.
Yes. If structural and individual evil are real, if systemic oppression, human trafficking, genocide, and brutal abuse are actively destroying human lives.
And tearing apart the fabric of creation.
Right. Then a God who merely observes from the heavens, offering nothing but mild disapproval or therapeutic empathy.
That God is morally bankrupt.
Exactly. The lecture argues that a truly good God, a God of holy love, must possess a love that is inherently defensive.
So the divine warrior motif is not about a deity who just has a bad temper and delights in bloodshed.
No, it is about a God who takes necessary protective action to limit destruction.
To break the power of perpetrators.
And ultimately to protect the victims from being entirely annihilated by systemic evil.
And to ground this, the lecture points to the Exodus narrative as the primary moral anchor for this entire concept.
The Exodus story is essential here.
Right, because we are not just talking about abstract philosophical war, we have to look at the actual story.
What is happening in Exodus?
Well, you have an entire people group, the Israelites, enslaved.
For generations.
Yes. They're being subjected to brutal, systemic, structural evil by the Egyptian empire.
The literal infrastructure of sin.
They are crying out under the weight of state-sponsored infanticide and genocide.
It is horrific.
When God finally intervenes, he doesn't just send Pharaoh a strongly worded diplomatic letter asking for better labor conditions.
Right, a letter wouldn't stop a genocide.
He acts as the divine warrior against the violent powers of Egypt. He dismantles the economic and religious infrastructure of the empire.
But again, my prosecutor brain says, what about the plagues?
Right.
What about the Egyptian citizens? That feels like massive collateral damage just to free one group.
And that is the terrible tension of living in a deeply broken, structurally evil world.
That's messy.
The lecture doesn't pretend the judgment isn't devastating, but it asks us to weigh the reality.
The reality of the empire.
Yes. The Egyptian empire was actively executing an ongoing genocide. To stop a machine of that magnitude, the infrastructure powering it had to be broken.
In that specific historical context, judgment isn't random, sadistic wrath.
No. Judgment is salvation in action.
God's power is deployed specifically to break the teeth of the oppressor and liberate the victim.
If God does not judge Egypt, Israel is literally erased from history.
Furthermore, the lecture carefully points out that this defensive movement, this judgment, is not based on mere ethnic favoritism.
It wasn't that God just liked the Israelites' DNA more than the Egyptians.
How do we actually know this?
Because later in the biblical narrative, when Israel itself gets power and establishes its own systems of structural evil.
When they become the oppressor.
Right, when the Israelite kings start exploiting the poor, denying justice to the orphan and widow, and worshiping idols.
The divine warrior turns his judgment against them?
Exactly. He sends prophets to condemn them and eventually allows their kingdom to be dismantled by Babylon.
Which proves that the standard is universal goodness and justice, not blind tribal loyalty.
God holds his own covenant people to the exact same rigorous, terrifying standard of holy love.
That continuity is so crucial. But it raises a massive question for the New Testament.
Let's transition to the New Testament.
If the Old Testament establishes this necessary defensive judgment against empires, what happens when Jesus arrives?
Does Jesus just throw the sword away, apologize for the Old Testament, and say, never mind, let's just be nice to everyone?
That is the Marcion trap again.
Right.
And the source material argues that the New Testament does not make God more harmless.
God does not lose his edge.
Instead, the nature of the conflict shifts and deepens.
How does it shift?
In the Old Testament, the battlefront was often visible and physical. Human empires, geographic territories, physical armies.
Okay.
In the New Testament, with the arrival of the kingdom of God in the person of Jesus, the battlefront expands to the root cause.
The spiritual and the cosmic.
Yes, evil is revealed not just as bad human actors like Pharaoh or Caesar,
But as underlying spiritual powers.
systems of lies, dehumanization, and temptation that actually animate those empires.
I see. So when you look at the ministry of Jesus through the lens of the divine warrior,
He is acting with the exact same defensive authority, but his targets are the root systems.
he is casting out demons, breaking spiritual bondage.
He's a healing disease, which is a direct assault on the quadrant of natural evil.
He is fiercely confronting the corrupt religious and political structures of his day, overturning tables in the temple.
He is not shrugging at evil. He is aggressively pushing back the darkness.
The continuity is entirely intact.
Jesus is fighting for the ultimate renewal of creation.
Okay, so we have built a really strong, cohesive, theological and philosophical foundation here.
We really have.
We understand the categorization of evil, the theological continuity of God's character as integrated holy love, and the necessity of defensive movement to protect the vulnerable. But if I'm the prosecutor, I am sitting at my table shaking my head.
He's not convinced yet.
No. I am going to hold up the actual physical Bible, open it to the Old Testament, and say, that is great theory, guys.
But look at the text.
Exactly. Look at these actual words on the page. Read these intensely violent ancient texts where God commands cities to be destroyed.
You could talk about defensive love all day, but the text says what it says.
And he is right to point to the text. We cannot ignore the difficult passages.
This is exactly what the fourth category of the lecture addresses.
Hermeneutical methodology.
Or, as the material brilliantly and colloquially calls it, putting on the context glasses.
I absolutely love this concept.
Why is that?
Because when modern people encounter difficult, violent biblical texts, they almost always fall off the horse on one of two sides.
That was the first side.
On one side, people try to whitewash the text.
Oh, yeah.
They get uncomfortable and say, oh, well, that didn't really happen. It's just a spiritual metaphor for fighting the sin in your own heart.
Which completely strips the text of its actual historical and moral weight.
Right. And on the other side, people caricature it.
They read one isolated verse, completely stripped of its historical and cultural context.
Apply a 21st century modern ethical framework to it.
And conclude, see, God is a monster.
The context glasses provide a methodological toolkit to prevent both of those massive errors.
The lecture outlines 3 primary lenses we must look through to read these violent texts fairly and accurately.
Let's define the 3 lenses before we test them out on the evidence.
The first lens is genre and function.
Genre and function.
When you read a passage, you have to ask, what kind of text am I actually reading?
Is it a historical narrative simply reporting the ugly reality of what happened?
Is it apocalyptic poetry? Is it a prophetic warning?
Or is it a legal concession designed to mitigate harm in a deeply flawed ancient world?
If we treat an ancient legal regulation meant for damage control as if it were a timeless, perfect moral ideal, we will deeply misunderstand it.
The second lens is salvation history and actor.
This goes back to our timeline concept.
We have to ask, who is actually doing the acting in this text? Is this humans acting out of their own brokenness, or is it God initiating a specific judgment?
And crucially, where are we on the timeline?
Are we in the era of the ancient theocratic nation of Israel, surrounded by hostile empires that want to wipe them out?
Or are we in the era of the worldwide church?
The rules of engagement change based on the historical epoch of the rescue mission.
And the third lens, which is perhaps the most frequently ignored by modern readers, is language and ancient rhetoric.
Language and ancient rhetoric.
We have to ask, is this text using cultural conventions, idioms, or hyperbole that would have been obvious to an ancient reader but are completely foreign to us.
Ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric does not operate like a modern clinical post-Geneva Convention military protocol.
Okay, theory is good, but let's actually put the context glasses on and look at the evidence.
The lecture provides 3 specific case studies to demonstrate how this methodology works in practice.
Let's do an analytical breakdown of these, just like we would if we were cross-examining evidence in our courtroom.
Case number 1. Land acquisition and the wiped-out language in the books of Joshua and Judges.
The prosecutor's charge here is severe, and it is the most common one brought against the Old Testament.
The charge is that God commands genocide.
Yes. The text frequently uses language saying the Israelites wiped out everything that breathed and left no survivors when conquering Canaanite cities.
To a modern ear, that describes the statistical extermination of an entire ethnic population.
It sounds like literal genocide.
All right, let's put on the context glasses. Specifically, the language and ancient rhetoric lens. How does the lecture address this?
The lecture points out a massive historical reality that changes everything.
What is the reality?
The phrase wiped out or left no one alive was a standard, universally understood convention of ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric.
It was hyperbolic language.
Yes, used by literally every major empire in the region to describe a decisive military victory.
Wait, how do historians actually know that? How do we know it wasn't literal?
Because of archaeology. We have recovered ancient monuments from surrounding nations,
Like what?
like the Mesha stele from Moab, or Egyptian records from Ramses II, or Assyrian war logs.
And what do they say?
On these monuments, kings boast, "I destroyed this nation, I wiped out their seed, none are left breathing."
The exact same language.
Yes. Yet historical and archaeological records absolutely prove that those wiped out populations continued to exist, thrive, and trade for centuries afterward.
It was the ancient equivalent of trash talk.
Basically, it meant we completely shattered their military power, not we went house to house and statistically murdered every single civilian.
Like a modern sports team saying, we annihilated them on the field tonight, we slaughtered them.
We know they didn't commit a literal massacre. It's a genre convention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And furthermore, when we look at the internal evidence of the biblical text itself, it completely contradicts a literal reading of total extermination.
Right, because books written chronologically later in the Bible clearly describe these exact same Canaanite groups continuing to live in the land alongside Israel.
If a literal statistical genocide had occurred, those groups wouldn't be there to be written about.
And if we apply the salvation history lens to this, the lecture notes that this war was a uniquely bound, one-time historical judgment.
It was directed against profoundly corrupt cultures.
Cultures that institutionalize practices like state-sponsored child sacrifice.
It was meant to break their power and secure a safe harbor for the line of promise, not to serve as an ongoing blueprint for holy war.
That is a vital point. It was a specific judgment in a specific era.
The New Testament explicitly forbids the church from taking up the physical sword to conquer territory or force conversions.
If anyone uses the book of Joshua to justify modern warfare or crusades, they are completely violating the biblical timeline.
Context completely shifts the meaning. Okay, case number 2.
This is one that critics love to bring up.
Elisha and the bears
Yeah.
from 2 Kings chapter 2.
The prosecutor's charge is this. The prophet Elisha is walking down the road. He gets made fun of by some innocent little kids for being bald.
And in an act of petty, tyrannical rage, God sends 2 bears out of the woods to maul them.
It is presented as a cruel, random execution of children for a minor offense of mockery.
I will admit this one always deeply troubled me until I learned the context.
Let's apply the genre and salvation history lenses.
First, the translation of little children is historically inaccurate.
The Hebrew terminology used here points to a large gang of young men, not toddlers.
Second, look at the geography. Where is Elisha walking?
He is walking into Bethel.
And what is the significance of Bethel in the ancient world?
Bethel was the epicenter of institutionalized, state-sponsored idolatry in the northern kingdom of Israel.
It was the headquarters of the golden calf worship, which was entirely opposed to the covenant.
Third, who is Elisha? He is not just an old guy taking a walk.
He has just been appointed as the primary mouthpiece of God, taking over for Elijah.
So this gang of young men coming out of Bethel isn't just teasing a guy about a bad haircut.
This was a public, organized, wanton demonstration of contempt for God's prophetic word by a hostile mob at the very center of national apostasy.
Exactly. When you understand the context, the incident transforms.
The lecturer classifies this as a sign of macro judgment.
A terrifying warning signal to the entire nation.
It demonstrated that violently rejecting God's intervention and mocking his prophets would lead to the nation being consumed by the chaos of the natural world.
Represented by the wild bears.
It is a highly specific event tied to the prophetic office in a unique moment of salvation history.
It is absolutely not a timeless moral model authorizing human beings to seek violent retaliation when their feelings are hurt.
It is a severe text, yes, but it is not random sadism. Okay, case number 3, and this is perhaps the heaviest one.
The sole daughter text in Exodus 21.
The prosecutor's charge here. The Bible explicitly endorses and legitimizes sex slavery and the systemic oppression of women by giving laws that allow a father to sell his own daughter into servitude.
Let's apply the genre and function lens here, because this requires us to understand the harsh socioeconomic reality of the ancient Near East.
We have to recognize that this is a legal text regulating an ancient social reality, primarily driven by extreme poverty and the constant threat of famine.
In the ancient world, there were no government welfare systems.
There was no bankruptcy protection, there were no homeless shelters.
If a family ran out of food and land, they starved to death.
The lecture explains that this biblical text is absolutely not establishing God's ideal for human relationships.
It is regulating a desperately fallen, broken world.
The sale mentioned in the text was not a transfer into chattel slavery, and it was certainly not a sex trafficking ring.
It was a transfer into a household arrangement, acting as a final desperate social security net to keep the family from starvation.
And here is where the close reading, the actual hermeneutical methodology, is essential.
The lecture points out that this specific biblical text, when compared to other ancient laws like Hammurabi's Code, actually mandates unprecedented protective clauses for the woman.
Clauses that were radically humane for that era.
What kind of clauses?
First, it legally forbade the family or the master from selling her to a foreign people, which protected her from actual chattel slavery.
Second, it mandated that if the master's son took her as a wife, she must be treated with the full status and rights of a freeborn daughter, not a slave.
And crucially, it placed strict, non-negotiable legal obligations on the man.
He was legally required to provide her with adequate food, clothing, and marital rights.
And the most important part of the text is what happens if he breaches that contract.
Exactly.
The text explicitly states that if the man fails to provide any of those 3 things, she is to be released.
Immediately.
And unconditionally, without any ransom or debt having to be paid, she walks out a free woman.
When you read the text closely, the law was actually designed to preserve human dignity.
To limit the power of wealthy masters.
And to provide a legal escape hatch for vulnerable women in a brutal socioeconomic reality.
It was damage control meant to prevent systemic abuse, not legitimize it.
When you apply the context glasses to all 3 of these difficult cases, the prosecutor's caricature simply falls apart.
Now, the lecture is very clear. This doesn't mean these ancient texts are suddenly easy or comfortable to read.
They're still dealing with war, extreme poverty, and severe judgment.
The ancient world was a dark place.
But the context completely changes the fundamental nature of what is happening.
We are no longer looking at an arbitrary, sadistic monster in the sky.
We are looking at holy love, navigating the agonizing, gritty reality of a corrupted world to preserve a path to ultimate salvation.
Which brings us to the 5th and final category of our deep dive, the existential synthesis.
We have defined evil. We have traced the continuity of God's character from Genesis.
We have understood the necessity of defensive movement, and we have learned how to properly read the difficult texts.
We have built a rigorous academic intellectual defense.
But the lecture, wonderfully, doesn't just end in the ivory tower.
It can't, because theology is entirely empty if it cannot be lived.
Right. How do we actually live with this knowledge? Because even if I win the courtroom debate, I still have to walk out of the courthouse into a world where children still get sick.
Where political corruption still ruins lives.
Where suffering is still a daily, tangible reality. How does this lecture tell us to exist in that space?
The lecture concludes that believers exist in a state of profound inherent tension.
We live in the timeline between the cross and the consummation.
Let's define those 2 anchors.
The cross represents the ultimate historical moment where God proved he is not distant.
He deeply entered into the horror of human suffering.
Experiencing the full weight of both moral evil, the injustice of the execution, and natural evil, the physical agony of death.
He's subjected himself to the brokenness.
And the consummation is the promised future horizon, the end of the timeline, where evil is finally, permanently, and definitively eradicated from creation.
So we are caught in the middle. They already, but not yet.
We know the victory is secured by the cross, but we are still waiting for the consummation.
And the source material outlines three very specific, highly practical postures for how a person is supposed to exist in that middle tension without losing their mind or their faith.
The first posture is lament.
We mentioned this briefly at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Lament is the practice of naming evil, honestly.
It means looking at the suffering in the world or in your own life without downplaying it.
Without repressing your grief.
And absolutely, without hiding behind cheap religious platitudes like God just needed another angel.
If you are listening to this and you have ever felt like you are losing your mind because bad things keep happening to good people and you feel guilty for being angry at God,
The biblical posture of lament is actually giving you permission to be angry.
the Bible is full of lament. A full third of the Psalms are cries of agonizing confusion.
Lament means looking at the brokenness of the world and screaming, "This is not how it is supposed to be."
The lecture gives us a brilliant defining catchphrase to remember this.
Lamentation is when I do not let go of God, even though I do not understand him.
It is an act of fierce, stubborn faith to bring your pain, your profound confusion, and your anger directly to the God you believe has the power to fix it, even when he seems silent.
The second posture is resistance.
If we have established through the divine warrior motif that God is fiercely opposed to evil, therefore, those who follow him must also be actively opposed to it.
Resistance means refusing to make peace with internal sin or external injustice.
It means not throwing your hands up in defeat and saying, well, the world is just broken, what can you do?
A catchphrase the lecture provides for this posture is, resistance is holiness in action, personally and publicly.
Personally and publicly. Meaning you fight the structural evil where you have influence.
You speak truth to power. You advocate for the vulnerable.
You refuse to participate in economic exploitation. You protect the weak.
You set boundaries against abuse in your own family.
Resistance is the earthly daily reflection of God's defensive love.
And the final posture is hope.
But the lecture makes a razor-sharp, vital distinction here. This is not a naive, Hallmark card optimism.
It is not a toxic positivity.
And it is certainly not the belief that everything happens for a reason. As we establish in the foundational premise, trying to force a meaning onto senseless evil is a form of spiritual abuse.
Biblical hope is entirely different.
Biblical hope is an absolute, definitive promise. The catchphrase here is, hope is not explanation, hope is the end of evil.
We may never get an explanation in this lifetime that satisfies our intellectual curiosity about why a specific tragedy occurred.
The math will never work out.
But we are given the ironclad promise that evil has an expiration date.
It is a temporary intrusion in God's universe, and he is actively moving history toward its total elimination.
If we bring this all back to our opening scene,
The courtroom is still quiet. The atheist prosecutor is waiting for our response.
we have presented the evidence of Matthias Florick's lecture.
We have not dismissed the prosecutor's charge that evil is real and horrifying.
In fact, by defining it as a parasite that corrupts creation, we have agreed with the horror of it more deeply than he might have expected.
But we have fundamentally reorganized the evidence.
We have shown that the defensive movements of the Old Testament and the sacrificial mercy of the New Testament are not evidence of two different gods.
They are the dynamic, historically unfolding actions of one perfectly consistent God.
A God of holy love, waging a long, sustained war against the evil that is destroying his creation.
The defense rests. The verdict derived from this academic framework is clear.
It is not a story of two gods. It is the story of one holy, immensely merciful God who takes evil so seriously, who hates it so completely that he is willing to enter into it, judge it, and ultimately end it.
That is the comprehensive view provided by the source material. It is a demanding framework.
It requires careful reading, a willingness to confront our own deep complicity in human brokenness, and the patience to understand ancient, unfamiliar contexts.
But it yields a perspective that is infinitely more robust, intellectually satisfying, and emotionally sustainable than a shallow caricature.
It gives you solid ground to stand on when the world feels like it's shaking.
It certainly does. Thank you for walking through this incredibly dense, powerful material with me. This has been a true deep dive.
It's been great.
But before we sign off, we want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over. Something to chew on long after this audio ends.
Consider this. The lecture insists, right from the foundational premise we discussed, that evil is a negation of the good.
Meaning it is inherently senseless.
It has no ultimate, satisfying logic or reason waiting to be discovered. Yet in our modern culture, we are utterly obsessed with finding closure.
When a senseless tragedy strikes, we desperately search for a reason to explain why it happened, hoping that understanding the mechanics of it will somehow lessen the pain.
But if this lecture is right, if evil is, at its core, inherently senseless,
Does our desperate, modern search for meaning in every suffering actually trap us?
does the relentless quest to figure out the why prevent us from engaging in the raw biblical practices that actually help us survive it?
Does our obsession with finding an explanation stop us from doing the difficult, messy work of lament and the courageous, costly work of resistance?
That's something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.